Thank you. Thank you very much, Inakshi, and thank you for that introduction. And welcome, everybody, to this discussion of the Sri Lanka's economic and political crisis. I suppose maybe we should use the plural, crises, perhaps. As Inakshi just mentioned, we have a stellar panel today to decode the situation. And what I thought we'd do is to ask each speaker to speak for about 5 minutes or so. And then we'd have a discussion among ourselves and open it up to questions from the audience as well. So please enter your questions in the Q&A box if you're on Zoom. But let me begin by abusing my position as moderator by mentioning a few of the issues that I hope the panelists will cover. I think we all know that Sri Lanka's economic crisis has been brought on by originally a debt crisis, which has morphed into a broader economic crisis. Inakshi mentioned inflation was running at almost 30% in April. But Sri Lanka is one of 35 developing countries identified by the World Bank and the IMF 2.5 years ago as facing critical foreign debt issues. And 9 of them are in talks with the IMF on adjustment loans and so on. The problem is not just Sri Lankan actions, some of which probably didn't make much economic sense, but the fact is that the pandemic, the slowdown of the world economy in 2020 effectively cut Sri Lanka's three main sources of foreign exchange earnings: tourism, remittances, commodity exports. And the problem is therefore structural. And I do hope that we can maybe see, is there a way forward? Because whatever's agreed with the IMF or the kinds of, credits that India has been offering, for instance, these are really band-aids which could tide you over a period, but how do we address the structural issues here? Of course, the economic crisis is overlaid by a political crisis, mass demonstrations, as Inakshi mentioned, demanding that the president go. And after weeks of peaceful protests, there's now been violence, and Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned, had to flee Temple Trees under military protection. But where does that lead politically? On the streets, of course, the atmosphere is electric and probably exhilarating. Freedom is in the air. And sentiment so far is not directed at foreigners, as it wasn't through 26 years of civil war, nor is a civil war in any classical sense likely. But martial law would be hard to enforce. And I'm not sure that even that is necessary. I mean, the president seems virtually undislodgeable constitutionally, short of impeachment and his own resignation. And impeachment is really complicated. He has executive powers. And frankly, I'm not sure that anyone in their right mind would want the task of trying to fix this mess. So where does this lead? Does it lead to a technocratic government? To negotiate with the IMF, to take the steps that everyone knows is necessary but are likely to be unpopular. I hope that outcome is that it's a peaceful outcome that we'll see. But of course, the basic terms of reference remain to be agreed. Whether and how it would abolish the executive presidency, that is the demand of those on the street. In Sri Lanka, at least, authoritarian politics based on charisma have come up against economic reality and the people's anger. But nothing is permanent in politics, as the Philippines elections just showed. So, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear from the panelists where they think this is going. The third problem that I would raise is international apathy. The developing country debt crisis has been discussed and highlighted at every G20 meeting for several years. The world has done nothing. Even China, frankly, which holds a sizable piece of Sri Lanka's debt, has been slow to react, even slower than India. And I don't see this changing very easily in the foreseeable future. Ukraine seems to have taken all the oxygen out of the West's room. And as the international situation gets more polarized, fragmented, we can expect probably less of the international system or the multilateral system. So what are the alternatives that we should be considering? Easy to say, hard to do. Can we think outside the box? Let's see. India, of course, in its latest statement, has expressed support for Sri Lanka's democracy, stability, and economic recovery. There was no mention of the government, only the people and democracy. While the government of India clearly don't want to be seen to be interfering, but they also want to use the crisis to make India the friend of first resort across the political spectrum in Sri Lanka. And that's going to be not so easy. But let's see. So having abused my position, let me now turn to our panelists and ask them to speak for a few minutes, tell us how they see the problem and the way forward. Can we start with you, Indrajit?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And let me also thank the Heritage Society for inviting me to be part of this very illustrious panel. I think it's what you said about the problems being structural in nature is very important. I mean, this is an unprecedented crisis. I don't think Sri Lanka has experienced this type of... I'm going to focus on the economic crisis because Bhavani is far better placed than I am to comment on the political side. But this is an unprecedented crisis. The scale and magnitude of it is something that we in post-independent Sri Lanka have not seen before. But it has been in the making for almost 70 years. Sri Lanka was second to Japan on most socioeconomic indicators in Asia at the time of independence. And there's complex causality behind the regression of Sri Lanka down the pecking order. However, in my view, arguably the most important causal factor has been macroeconomic stress through almost the whole of those 70 years. And a number of the other problems of a social and political nature have stemmed from this macroeconomic stress that has been there. And the primary cause of the macroeconomic stress has been the government's budgetary operations. We have had a toxic mix of populist politics and an entrenched entitlement culture among the people. And the two have fed off each other. There have been negative feedback loops. And these unsustainable budget deficits have pumped excess demand into the system. And if one were to characterize the Sri Lankan economy for much of the last 70-odd years, is to say that it has been a high budget deficit, high inflation, high nominal interest rate, and largely overvalued and volatile currency economy. That is diametrically the opposite to what the successful countries of East and Southeast Asia have achieved. So this is a problem that's been there for many years. And Sri Lanka is a classic twin deficit country. It's at a budget deficit and it's a current account deficit. The budget deficit now is largely due to inadequate revenue. And the inadequate revenue predates the untimely tax cuts that were introduced in December 2019. Even before that, we lacked revenue. And that's because we gave a lot of tax concessions during the war to get projects over the hurdle rate of return. But when the war ended, those were not removed. Vested interests managed to protect them. And also because the successive governments didn't do the structural reforms which brought down the cost of doing business and facilitate business, they had to compensate for this poor business environment by giving tax concessions, which meant that the government constantly ran surpluses, and the central bank was often compelled to participate in fiscal forbearance in its monetary policy, which amplified the problems in terms of creating instability in the economy. So that was the budgetary side. And on the balance of payment side, exports, which were about exports of goods and services, were 39% of GDP in the year 2000. They have fallen to 20% of GDP. And that is because of one, often an overvalued exchange rate, increase in protectionism, and Sri Lanka has not been able to participate in the most dynamic component of the international trading system in the last 25 years or so, which is these cross-border supply chains. Because in these modern supply chains, you have to bring the distinction between imports and exports gets blurred. You have to bring the stuff in, do your thing, and send it out. We stuck non-tariff barriers in the middle. We put cessors, we put other kind of protectionist measures, which then meant that we became uncompetitive for these supply chains and have negligible presence. So because of this, our export performance in terms of the basket of goods, the markets, etc., haven't been diversified. The complexity of the products have not increased in terms of adding value and bringing us higher levels of revenue. So all this has meant that Sri Lanka is a classic twin deficit economy. Going into the crisis, that was the state of the Sri Lankan economy. Then you had the other proximate causes, some self-inflicted, some exogenous. The self-inflicted ones were an unsolicited tax reduction, extremely, I can talk about it during the discussion, extremely untimely. The fertilizer ban, which had pretty devastating impact on agriculture. And of course, agricultural exports are quite an important part of Sri Lanka's export structure as well. And also the kind of course, we need a homegrown strategy, but the alternate strategy that was tried essentially led to a downgrading of the rating of the Sri Lankan economy, a loss of access to international capital markets. We are a middle-income country, so access to capital markets are important for us. And on top of that, we had also clearly the pandemic and now the Ukraine crisis, global commodity prices, etc. So all this taken together have created a perfect storm. So how do we get out of it? So there are 5 priority areas which the government has now embarked upon. It has put new people into key places. A couple of them were my former colleagues in the central bank, so I know them well, and I really do think they will do the job, given the opportunity to do it. And these priority areas are the IMF program. We can flesh it out in the discussion. Debt restructuring, the bridging finance, and here India is playing a massive role. India has already provided, I think, 1.9 plus 2.5, about $4.5 billion worth of support by way of import lines of credit, an RBI swap, and it has essentially deferred payments under the Asian Clearing Union to the tune of about 2.5 billion, and a further 1.5 billion is, I think, being under consideration. So that's about 6 billion worth of support, critical for securing the sustenance of the Sri Lankan people. But there are other forms of bridging finance also we need. So we have the IMF program, debt restructuring, bridging finance, and we have to ensure that our banking system is secure. There is some stress there. The central bank has said it will do everything possible to secure the stability of the banking system, but that has to be achieved. And also, probably most crucially, given all the changes that are taking place and the increases in costs that are going to come, that have already come through, and more will come down the pipeline, we need to strengthen our safety net. And we need to have a better design, better targeted safety net. And we, like India, we need to use technology to reduce the leakages in the safety net. So let me finally say, the potential of the country has not gone away. The location, and we are very well placed to take advantage of the high growth that India is going to experience in the next 5, 10, 15 years. There is a well-educated population, human resources are pretty strong, but we need to get better at exploiting this potential. For the government needs to have evidence-based policy making, and objective decisions need to be made, which are removed from rigid ideology. And on the private sector side, they need to be less dependent on rent seeking based on political patronage, and become much more focused on entrepreneurial activity. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't exceeded my time.
But that was masterly. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Bhavani, would you like to speak to the political crisis?
Sure. And thank you again for inviting me and to Asia Society. I'm one of their fellows, and it's good to be back with the Asia Society family. So I think the moderator and everyone else has kind of played out as to what's happening on the ground. But in terms of just giving some context to those who may not be aware of what's happening, the peaceful protests that commenced 2 months ago were very much citizen-led movement. And that's quite a unique thing to remember in Sri Lanka. We've had years and decades of protests, but this kind of number, thousands of people coming peacefully to protest, was something quite unique and to some extent united people. And I'll speak to that moment and what that means to Sri Lanka if we have time now or in the discussion. But that's something to remember, that these started as peaceful, very much demanding for a system change. And the demands also range from the resignation of the president to the resignation of the government. Now, as I said, it's been peaceful so far. There were a few incidents of violence, but till Monday, so this week is quite critical in terms of understanding what's happening. Till Monday, the peaceful protesters, and some were staying overnight in several sites and across Sri Lanka, were able to demonstrate, protest, and have no problems. On Monday, what happened was the several individuals who were having a meeting with the then Prime Minister, he has resigned subsequently, went out to the streets and there was violence, targeting the peaceful protesters. And as a result, we've seen in the last 2 days, protests turning violent and violence spreading to a point of, and that was the tipping point, that violence is now seen targeting properties belonging to members of parliament, those linked to the government. But there is a worrying concern on the ground that this violence could also trigger other aspects. And that's something to keep in mind because Sri Lanka is going through quite a unique moment and there is fragility and cycles of violence. All of these things need to be looked into. So the protests were very clear in their demands. We need a system change that involves the resignation of the president and the resignation of the government. Now, we've seen in early April, the resignation of the cabinet, several ministers, but it was a reshuffling in a sense where several came on board and there was a smaller cabinet appointed. The Prime Minister and the President remained. After the violence on Monday, the Prime Minister did finally resign after several weeks of demanding for his resignation. But it was long, while it was long overdue, it was insufficient because the violence spread. And several of us, despite the curfew, and I want to also be very clear, we are in a state of emergency. There is a curfew in place. And the emergency is very important because Sri Lanka has a history of using emergency, and that's also been used to crush dissent, target political opponents and minorities. And Sri Lanka's history is very important in that we've seen decade cycles of violence, as well as a near 3-decade war. And all this really kind of comes to fruition now, and we need to look at these issues, some of the unresolved problems and the root causes of the conflict. But what we've seen so far is also violence spreading. And there is instability because the president refuses to go home despite continuous demands from different stakeholders, from the political opposition to civil society, to religious leaders, to the public. And one of the things we also need to remember is Gotabaya Rajapaksa came into office in 2019, promising so much, promising economic prosperity, stability, security. And 2.5 years later, it's been a spectacular disaster. And the confidence people had with the strong leader has fast diminished. And there's really no confidence in the president. There is actually no legitimacy in terms of the present governing elite. And that's something also we need to remember when we're looking to solutions, who is able to come on board. So the president at the moment is very much refusing to resign or see a peaceful transition. And today we've seen the military on the streets. Despite the curfew and the state of emergency, the protesters continue to be on the streets, and this is quite remarkable. These are young and old protesters. I mean, it's a mix from the middle class to the more vulnerable, and they are refusing to go home. And the demand is clear. We won't go home till President goes home. But at what cost does this come? Because Indrajit painted a very dreary picture in terms of the economic crisis, but in terms of the political crisis, we are at a stalemate. The opposition is refusing to take office as long as the president remains as the executive presidency. Parliament is adjourned. The party leaders had a meeting, but there is for different reasons, including security, there is a worry to meet in Parliament. And that's something to also talk about, because now members of Parliament fear for their own safety. And that's a very, very dangerous situation. So we have a very strong executive president whose powers were consolidated under this government in 2020 under the 20th amendment to the Constitution. We have a very powerful executive president, and then we have a parliament that is really unable to also come together at this moment, because, you know, if we saw what happened last week in the appointment of a deputy speaker, there was a resignation, then there was a lot of back and forth, and then he was appointed but resigned, and it speaks to the situation on the ground in terms of looking to Parliament for solutions. And this has also resulted in people being disgruntled with the members of Parliament. And that's a very, very worrying situation. So a very powerful executive president with a military background. I'll end very soon. A parliament that's unable to find a solution. There are several processes in Parliament, including a no confidence motion against the president, as well as private members' bills. And I think that's something to look at, because one demand is abolishing the executive presidency, and many see this present crisis linked to the very powerful executive presidency. But the demands are now moving to a complete system change, and that's the worries. What are the things people are demanding? When also there's very little confidence in the elected representatives. Finally, and this is my last point, is the military, the role of the military. Under the Rajapaksas, not just from 2019, but from 2005 onwards, when Mahinda Rajapaksa was the president, we have seen the strengthening and entrenching of the military in Sri Lanka in terms of governance, in terms of civil administration. And they are an extremely powerful entity at the moment. Now we have the military on the ground. There is worry that there might be we had a family rule, that it might transition to military rule. So this is something to really keep in mind as to what this could entail for democracy. But I think we are at a stalemate. We are at crossroads, but it's also crisis mode with no real answers in terms of a political settlement. So really this conversation is timely, but it's also a situation where we don't see many answers till the president goes home. So I'll end my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. It was very clear, but very worrying at the same time. May I now ask Professor Muni to tell us what he thinks?
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Menon, and to the Asia Society for giving this opportunity to join this, I think, a very distinguished panel. Most of the points have been made. Let me flag 5 major points, which probably because of time constraint cannot go into the details. First, it is true that it is a structural problem, but I would put responsibility more on the leadership, which has not been able to understand and grasp these structural constraints and limitations. And actually, the whole crisis is out of the mismanagement, which both my Ambassador Menon and Dr. Coomaraswamy hinted at. We have the details of those mismanagement have already been spelled out, so I'll pass it over. Secondly, it is economic crisis, but actually the spillover is largely political. And political spillover is beyond the economic issues as well. The economic issues are on the board, but non-economic issues are equally important. And amongst the non-economic issues is the authoritarian nature of the regime, the family nature of the regime, and people's fear or suspicion of the corrupt nature of the regime. Family-wise, almost 72% of the economy was controlled by the Rajapaksa family, and everybody knew it. Now, in terms of corruption charges, I think even for President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, there were investigations in the last regime. And I understand Sri Sena somehow mediated, softened them in one way or the other. So the people's anger, and then add to this the failure in resolving the ethnic issue. In fact, the ethnic sharpness has increased after the Easter bombings also, where Muslims have also feeling more and more alienated. So it's a mix-up. Besides the economic problem, it is a mix-up of all these factors of authoritarianism, of corruption, of family control, of ethnic alienation and dissatisfaction, which has bursted out in what Bhavani said, consistent problems and protests which have come. If you look at the polity, my next point is the polity is divided. If you look at the polity, you find differences, serious differences even amongst the opposition on how to approach or how to handle this economic problem. Even on the question of constitutional changes, on the question of the presidency to be transformed, on the question of what should be the interim arrangement, the opposition stands divided. And that is creating another dilemma. Then there are differences within the ruling family, where I find that I think both the president and the prime minister, their brothers, brought each other up and had serious differences, because Mahinda Rajapaksa has been complaining that he has not been on the board of most of the decisions which have been taken by the president. And the president has, it has become, there are writings even on the Sri Lankan media about the differences in the family. People are alienated from the political class as a whole, either opposition or ruling party. They have no faith in anybody that they can deliver them in one way or the other. And very interestingly, and I think very powerfully, the business community and the Sangha has come on the side of the protesters, which means a total isolation of the regime which has taken place. So there is no way that this regime could now really deliver. Now, before I come to the last point of way out, I want to say a word or two about India's approach. I think India's approach has been at three levels. One, to help the people who are facing the severe crisis on the front of food, fuel, medicine. So $3 billion to be offered for meeting this crisis. And I think India's responsibility is there towards the neighbor. Otherwise, they spill over from the neighbors. We have been hearing reports of trickle down of some of the refugees coming there. Well, that's not a major issue to my mind, but there is a problem that anything which happens in Sri Lanka will have a spillover on India. Secondly, in terms of regime, stability is absolutely critical. Therefore, whosoever is in power, India has to go along with that. In fact, the central government refused Tamil Nadu to send direct assistance because that would have further, widened the fault lines on the ethnic front and, would not have been good for India's own image. And therefore, regime has to be accepted as it is, whosoever is in power. But this is my personal view, that not many tears would be shed on Rajapaksa's exit. from Sri Lanka, either at prime minister's level or president's level. And thirdly, India has a problem of the strategic encroachment by China. Therefore, even in this process, India has been trying to see that the Chinese occupying of the Indian strategic space, whether it is in the northeast, in northern part, even in Colombo, should be reduced and contained as far as possible. So the Indian outreach to Sri Lanka in helping them meet this crisis is operating at 3 levels. Now, what could be the way out in terms of solution? I think I agree with Bhavani and all others, most of the analysts, that it's a total political vacuum and a total dilemma as to what to do. But I think much depends upon what President Gotabaya would do. And he has clearly 2 options. One in which he can smoothly bring about a transition and gradual solution of the problem. Another one which can precipitate far more turbulence than what it is. First, in which he can do it smoothly, that he should go and let the speaker function as an interim president with an all-party government, interim government, which may hold elections after 6 months or so, as Bhavani has pointed out. And that would probably that would ensure even the friendly countries like India, China, IMF, anybody else who wants to, yes, Ambassador Menon is absolutely correct that international community is not very sensitive to these problems, but that probably would encourage a smooth transition, would encourage the international community to be as helpful as it is possible. The second is the military rule, that out of violence and military, the president has a strong constituency in military, and that would be a path of a greater turbulence. So I think what the outcome would be depend much upon President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and as to which route he wants to take. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I think we seem to have a fair amount of agreement between our panelists about the stalemate, the impasse that we've arrived at politically, and that really is going to affect how successful Sri Lanka is in dealing with the economic crisis, which has come to a head. But I do have one question, and particularly of Bhavani and Professors Muni as well. Assuming that the president does resign tomorrow, I mean, I'm not sure that that's likely, but then what? What is the morning after? Professor Muni has said speaker as president acting. Is that constitutional? Is that actually provided? I mean, how does this work? Or is the alternative chaos?
Shall I come in here?
Yes, please.
So I just lost power. I did warn this would happen. This is the new norm in Colombo, in Sri Lanka, that we do have these power cuts, but this was delayed by half an hour. In terms of what next, what would happen, there's particular scenarios that's already provided in the Constitution. So I think we need to look at especially in terms of the present crisis and the instability, we need to go back to what is already provided by law, by the Constitution. The Speaker can come in till the Parliament elects a member to act, to be president for the remainder of the term. So that's provided in the Constitution. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that person needs to be there forever. I think the political arrangements can come in where there's an agreement, the interim arrangement or interim government could be for 6 months till there is stability, till there's a plan, and then you get a mandate from the people, because this is unprecedented. But at the same time, now the Constitution says it has to be a member of Parliament, but a member of Parliament could be through the national list as well. So there are conversations that do you bring in someone new from the national list to be the president, to be elected by Parliament till there is some form of recovery phase and get some confidence and initiate the initial plans. So there's some ideas, but that's provided in the Constitution. Whether it actually happens, I don't know. I think, as I kept saying, the first thing is for the president to resign, and that seems to be the hardest thing at this moment. And for the military and others who've really entrenched themselves and enjoying quite a lot of power, will they go home peacefully? That's also the question. And one thing I want to put in there is, post the resignation of the Prime Minister, the violence we saw raises questions whether there will be a peaceful transition. And I think we need to be prepared for different scenarios. Not to be alarmist, but best be prepared.
It seems to me that the example of Myanmar should give the military some pause. It's not so easy going against one's own people. But I don't know. That's not for us to say. Would you want to add anything, Professor Muni?
Well, I had looked at this constitutional process because after the president, the prime minister gets into the chair, and since the prime minister is not there, it has to be the speaker. Now, the problem really is political, that in terms of parliament electing one individual, there are, as I said already, there are divisions, but in view of the crisis and in view of the protests outside all over the country, I think Parliament would get pressured to evolve a consensus on one individual. And then it is a temporary arrangement in any case, because it's not going to bring about major changes except to cushion the kind of pressure which has been created both on economy and polity. So I think that is a possible course. And I would underline that even the Lawyers Association has given that kind of a possible scenario in which President Gotabaya has discussed and consulted them, and apparently at least has said that yes, he is willing to go by that. So therefore, I think this is a possibility. But the other one is that his own sense of insecurity may lead him not to accept this process and actually go through the military method. Now, I have a feeling that even military would be thinking that if they can manage the whole country, even if they're clutched. And if that is the situation, then in that case, I think military would also advise the president to go through a way which is far more smoother. This is just a conjecture, I know that, but that's what I think would be the best way.
Well, we're all groping here. I mean, none of us can answer, actually. I think what I'm hearing is that it's possible to think of even a technocratic government, since no politician will want responsibility for the mess, that it's possible constitutionally, legally, but what is most likely, we don't know, because as this seems to be a matter of individual decisions and driven largely by fear also in this situation. So I think that's a problem, whether it's fear among the MPs, whether it's fear, on the part of the president of what happens. Let's see. I think we'd have to wait. I had one question for Dr. Coomaraswamy, actually. Of the 5 things that you mentioned as the way forward, 3 of them involve the rest of the world very deeply. I mean, both the IMF program, debt restructuring, bridging finance, even for the other 2, strengthening safety nets and so on. That's not something that I think the Sri Lankan economy can support right away on its own. It would need. But do you see that coming? Do you see the world? Because Sri Lanka is not the only problem on the world's plate. I mean, when the World Bank says 35, World Bank and IMF say there are 35 countries at grave risk today. Pakistan's also there. I mean, there's a whole host of several other countries. How does the world system respond to this?
So let me say this. Before I just directly answer your question, Ambassador, let me say that, it's absolutely right. My 2 co-panelists have stressed the spillover from the economic to the political and the complex political landscape that we now face. But, the situation is bad, but we still haven't seen how bad it could get very, very quickly if we don't act in terms of getting an IMF program and doing the restructuring. India is just about securing our sustenance, but they're not going to do that forever. It's not possible for them to do that forever. And we are not getting enough foreign exchange, anywhere near enough foreign exchange to be able to sustain ourselves in terms of our essential imports. So this, in fact, Dr. Veerasinghe, the current central bank governor, just this morning in a press conference, said that he would resign in 2 weeks unless there was a viable government he could work with. Because that's absolutely the right position to take. Because we are teetering on the edge. And what we have seen so far is nothing like as bad as it can get if we don't get our act together fairly quickly. So absolutely, is the international community being forthcoming? As much as they can at this point. I mean, the IMF is certainly there in strength. I think we are having ongoing discussions that are taking place remotely, but there are ongoing discussions at the moment on the program. We would like them to go a bit faster, but they are forthcoming. They are trying to do what they can. The World Bank has already provided $400 million of repurposed lending, 180 million of that for social transfers, and another 200 million for fertilizer imports. So that 400 million is intended for the safety net, and they've come quickly, and they are, I think, intending to give another 300 million. Now, I think India, as I said, in all, I think there is about 6 billion which is under consideration, of which 4.5 billion has already been committed. So, India has played the major role. Without that, would have been even worse difficulty. And the fund and the bank are forthcoming. There are, I think, about 3 World Bank teams in Colombo at the moment, looking at different aspects of the economy. But we need money quickly. As you know, these large institutions, they take some time. They have processes they have to go through. That's perfectly understandable. They dispense public money. But we are urgently in need of foreign exchange. And then the government is still talking to other friendly governments as well to see whether they can do that. I think the short answer is the Sri Lanka's development partners, Sri Lanka's friends have been forthcoming. But we have got ourselves into such a big mess that, we are putting a lot of pressure on them to help us to the extent that we need to get the help. The sense I'm getting is that India is willing to secure the sustenance of Sri Lankans. So that's
reassuring.
Very reassuring.
Thank you for that. I should get out of the way. We already have 21 questions in the Q&A. But I can't resist asking you one of those questions. Dr. Coomaraswamy, would you be open to enter Parliament through the National List and play an active PM or Finance Minister, says Adisha Pereira?
Adisha, I've had my day. I have a bit of an advisory role now, and I think that is what I should limit myself to. There are younger people, there are very able people who can do that, and I will give my utmost support to Sri Lanka, but I think it's best done in an advisory capacity. Thank you. Thank you, Adisha.
Maybe we can turn to Viju Parameswar, who was asked that the economy remains dependent on a very limited number of sectors. And this would seem to be the primary basic source of the economic problems when the pandemic has reduced tourism and so on. So are there any plans to expand the economic base? Is it possible to do so in a reasonable time? I think you've part answered it, but...
Yes. Yeah, no, certainly the potential is there. But it's true. If you look at our export basket, now there is a classic kind of comparison people make. In 1980, if you looked at Thailand's export basket and Sri Lanka's export basket in terms of diversity, complexity, there was hardly any difference. Now, massive difference. If you in 1995 or even 2000, if you looked at Vietnam's export basket and Sri Lanka's, it was roughly the same. You look at it now, there's a massive difference. So it can be done, but as I said, I think in my earlier remarks, we have made certain basic mistakes in terms of creating an environment, a business climate, which promotes diversification of the economy and which also gives people the confidence to commit investment over the long term. The state has played a large role in the economy, which I personally don't think in itself is a bad thing, provided it does so efficiently, and the Sri Lankan state is not efficient. And secondly, it creates a business climate for the private sector, which, as I said, promotes confidence to invest in the long term. And that has been absent. So that is why you haven't seen the diversification of the economy. And this macroeconomic stress, as I told you, what it does is it causes unpredictability in policies because interest rates go up and down. The exchange rate is volatile. And, taxes, taxes are suddenly imposed because the government finds itself in fiscal difficulty. So this kind of uncertainty in the macro framework makes it very difficult for people to take a long-term view of their investment plans. And that's why the economy hasn't diversified in the way it should have done. But it can do, given the right environment.
Thank you. Two political questions. One for you, Professor Muni, which from Surya Kumar Roy Chaudhary, saying the political spectrum is corrupted. You mentioned corruption as one of the problems. What will the protests achieve? They cannot wish away rampant corruption. The resignations of the president, the PM, ministers will not remove corruption. The other really for you, Dr. Fonseka, about violence. This is from Asanga, Abhay Gunasekara, saying violence was orchestrated by the regime against the protesters. Was it done to install a military regime by Gotabaya? Is it a Myanmar model in the making? You've hinted at this already.
On corruption, it is true. Corruption in a way is a part of all Asian societies. Maybe other societies also. I am talking about Asia. And it cannot be completely, rooted out simply by president or the prime minister going. But I said the anger of the people, which has expressed itself in terms of political protest, is beyond the economic crisis alone. Because the image of this regime on the first time, there were instances of corruption, there were instances of authoritarian rule. The way people disappeared, the way, and on the corruption charges, for instance, some of the unproductive investments which have come, like Matala Airport. Now, so much money has come in, which Sri Lanka has to pay back, but it is not generating revenues. So was also the case with Hambantota Port, which later on was changed into leasing and creating a special economic zone, which still has to come up in terms of revenues. So you had investments coming up, and these were bad decisions. And partly these decisions were driven by political corruption. There is a very strong view in Sri Lanka about that. And therefore, by the regime going out, the corruption issue I mentioned in that context. Now, Gotabaya can always think of a military rule, but neither in Myanmar, I am convinced, nor in Sri Lanka, it can be sustained. And this is where, particularly when people of all the sections, I said both the Sangha and the business community is supporting the protesters. I am sure President Gotabaya has intelligent people around to tell him that this is what the situation is. And if that is the situation, then there is absolutely no way that a military rule can be sustained for a long time. And that's why it will only generate turbulence. So President Gotabaya can go the Myanmar way, but it will be much worse than Myanmar, because Myanmar has had a tradition of military rules Sri Lanka doesn't have.
Thank you. Bhavani?
I think Professor Muni did respond to both, but can I just add, and I'll take both questions as well. In terms of Asanga's question, yes, there's evidence coming up that some of the violence was organized, and there's an organized nature because of the speed with which it happened and the particular way some of the targets were chosen. I raises questions, but till an investigation happens, I think we need to be careful. But my point earlier is, who was to gain by this violence and uncertainty, and that raised a lot of questions. And where does it go? The military, I raised this before, under the Rajapaksas have become a very strong institution. And the leadership in the military, and I don't speak to everyone, not the foot soldiers, but those who've been enjoying the perks of office, are not going to go home very easily. So, it's going to be, they need to be factored in any kind of negotiation in a transition. And this is not just the serving military. There's a lot of retired military officials in key positions, including very senior administrative positions. So and they continue to be very close to the executive presidency. So we have a situation of a very strong executive authoritarianism and militarization. And it's a very dangerous mix when the checks are very limited. Coming back to just accountability, but these are connected. One of the reasons we've had all these institutions becoming very powerful and corruption being rampant is there's been very limited work on the accountability front. And here one needs to look at the Yahapalana government, which was the previous government, which promised to address some of these allegations. Many of the cases didn't move forward, and that resulted in the Rajapaksas coming back. So we need to go back to some of those lessons. Why couldn't cases be taken forward in Sri Lanka? What were the setbacks? And it comes to some of the structural issues. We do not have independent institutions that can take forward these investigations, prosecutions without political interference. So one of the things that is being a demand from the protesters, and I connect back to the protests, is that there has to be system change. There have to be new reforms, but also a new political culture where there's accountability. Now, that will take a long time. That's not going to happen overnight. But I think it's an opportunity to really look at what didn't work in the past, what can work now, who are the new actors who need to come in, and what are the new institutions we require. And one of the proposals that is by the SJB in the private members' bill is strengthening particular institutions, including the central bank. And maybe Indrajit also can come in here, because some of the problems we've seen, the economic issues, is also linked to individuals, but also institutions not having the particular oversight, the checks that were required. So I think when we're talking about change in the culture, but change in institutions, we also need to think outside the box and bring in particular reforms and checks and balances. And this is an opportunity, I think, to do that, including addressing the militarization.
Indrajit, you want to?
Yes, on the central bank independence, I think it's crucial, Ambassador. Actually, there was a new central bank bill which sought to strengthen the autonomy of the central bank. It actually made its way into Parliament during the previous regime, but it ran out of parliamentary time because there was a change in government. And one thing, because what we've had over the last couple of years is very large-scale deficit financing by the central bank. Now, one of the things that the new central bank bill was trying to introduce was to prevent the central bank from investing in the primary market for treasury bills. That is, straight printing of money. And if that was in place, I wonder whether the tax cuts that were introduced in December 2019 would have actually come into being. Because I think knowing that if they get stuck on the revenue side, they can get the central bank to print money, would have given those who wanted to effect those tax cuts the comfort, a certain level of comfort, which they would not have had if the new central bank bill had been placed. And that would have been a far more risky proposition then to cut the taxes in the way they were cut. And so that is the whole point of having the checks and balances, of having an autonomous central bank, to lean into fiscal profligacy when it comes about. And yes.
There's a related question, which
yes.
I'd like to mention. Should Sri Lanka re-establish a currency board system?
Well, a currency board, if you're able to run it properly, does give you stability. But we don't have the prior conditions at the moment to have a currency board. Why do I say that? Because to have a currency board, you have to have a current account surplus in your balance of payments, so that is what gives you stability. That the money supply is related to your base of your reserves, but if you have this persistent deficit in the current account, then the currency board cannot operate in the way it should operate, because you will still have volatility and instability. And to try to create a current account surplus in the current circumstances could have very restrictive impact on the economy. The import compression that would be needed to have a persistent current account surplus until we are able to increase our export performance to the point where we can have a natural current account surplus, it wouldn't work. It would be make things worse. But over time, if like the countries which will have currency, both the Hong Kongs, the Singapore, etc., who have a current account surplus, then fine, you can have it. But we don't have the prior conditions.
Thank you. Two people have asked similar questions, Risha Roy, Arindam Chakravarti, about how much of this is BRI related? How much of this is brought on by excessive investment in large infrastructure projects?
So in my view, Sri Lanka has had a backlog of infrastructure investment. From the time of independence, we have done very well in terms of our social indicators. In fact, Sri Lanka is well known for its performance on the social indicators. But because the economy did not perform, did not generate the surpluses which were necessary both to do the social development and the infrastructure development lagged. So there was a lag in terms of infrastructure development. But what happened is we borrowed abroad to develop the infrastructure, again, necessary. But the investment, and here this is what Professor Muni was talking to us about, the investment that took place did not earn or save enough foreign exchange to service the debts that were incurred to build that infrastructure. And also you need a mix of projects, right? You need short-term projects of a short gestation, long gestation, so that, you manage it. We had a number of long gestation projects, which were prestige projects, which did not give us the return, which complicated debt management later on.
There's a question here, maybe Professor Muni or anyone who wants to. Pakyasuri Sarvanamutu asks, given that the government of India supports democracy and the people of Sri Lanka, how long will India provide assistance to Sri Lanka with a government led by him, meaning presumably the president?
Government,
led by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa.
No, I think I indirectly had addressed this question earlier. I said government of India would respect anyone who is in power. And it is entirely for Sri Lanka to decide whether it should be Gotabaya or SJB or JVP or SLFP or anybody. So whosoever is in power, the Indian interest would be to help people meet their difficulties. And therefore, Gotabaya as a person is, not very critical in deciding what kind of assistance should go. Yes, it would indirectly mean the support of the regime, which people are distorting, which it is not. As I said, that no tears would be shed in New Delhi if the Rajapaksa regime goes out, which it is going out in many ways. So that's very clear. I think Government of India will deal. Look, the way Government of India discouraged Tamil Nadu to send, they made a specific proposal that they would be sending the assistance directly to Sri Lanka, perhaps to the Tamil areas. The Government of India put its foot down because Government of India has to deal with the given structures.
I'm fighting a losing battle here. There's 55 questions in the Q&A box. And there is no way that I can get to all of them. I'm just sorry, unless we go on until tomorrow morning. But the interesting part is, despite all the gloom that we have purveyed here, there are people saying, Janaka Vijayanaka, for instance, saying one of the positives that we see in these troubling times is the coming together of young people, irrespective of differences in race and religion. There seemed to be some difference in what Professor Muni was saying about the ethnic divide still mattering and polarization with minorities, and the movement that Bhavani Fonseka was describing, which seemed broad-based and seemed to cut across these divides. Where are we actually?
Can I come in here?
May I?
Oh, Professor Muni, why don't you go ahead?
Want to go first?
No, go ahead. Bhavani, go ahead.
Okay. Maybe just because there is a particular question, I didn't have time to go into it during the initial comments. Let's recognize this is a unique moment. It's united many in their demand for a system change. That's for sure. And I don't want to undermine that. But there's also there's criticism also within this as to, for example, many in the North and East who were affected by the war saying, well, when we were protesting and we continue to protest, for example, the mothers of the disappeared have been on the streets over 1,900 days, and there wasn't any support or solidarity from the rest of the country. When people's lands were taken in the North and East, or the military occupation, many in the South, the majority community ignored those calls or still don't know what's going on. So there is a divide. There is definitely a divide. But that said, those that I speak to at least say, look, this is a moment for the South to also galvanize and to be heard, to really take it on, and that there will be support. And people have traveled from the North and East, despite the fuel crisis, despite the economic crisis, to come and be at these protests. So there is support at one level, but there's also within the protesters, I think there needs to be greater awareness in terms of some of our own challenges in the past, including the ethnic question, because I think there's very much the focus of the present, changing the present government, changing the system, but not always recognizing there are deep-rooted problems. And the ethnic question doesn't always get recognition. And I'll speak to one example. There was an event a couple of weeks ago at the main site where the national anthem was sung only in Sinhala. And for many, and a lot of the younger people, and this is quite the unique thing, younger protesters came out and said, no, we need to sing it in Tamil as well. And so they organized something spontaneously and did it. So there is now a recognition, at least among the younger protesters that we need to address all these problems, and we need to at least correct some of the problems or errors from the past. So there is some slow realization, but I think we won't be able to get everything right immediately. But there are also some tensions and divisions as well in terms of the protest demands that cannot be ignored.
Professor Muni?
Well, I said the protests have blurred some of the ethnic lines. There are two aspects which I was saying. Number one, that the regime's alienation on the ethnic front is felt, and which has been expressed in terms of protest, because everybody said that this is a regime which created not only economic, various other problems. After 2009, there was huge expectations in Sri Lanka that Mahinda Rajapaksa would emerge as a great statesman and bring about the reconciliation. And most of those hopes died out. So this is where the alienation, and then this Easter bombing, Muslim factor, which has come up in a big way. In relation to Rohingya, again, the ethnic issue came up in Sri Lanka. So alienation of the regime on the ethnic front has taken place. But the protests have blurred some of these lines. Now, that necessarily is not the solution of the ethnic problem. The solution would obviously, as Bhavani says, would come in long-term manners. But at the moment, people are forgetting their ethnic identities while protesting against the regime, while asking the regime to go, and while asking the system to go. So I think that is
a new Sri Lankan identity being formed.
Yes, and mostly young people, as Bhavani said, in fact, they have given a very interesting slogan, as all of us know, that you have kicked the wrong generation. That's precisely what they're saying, that you have really touched on the wrong generation by alienating them.
May I just make one observation on this, if I may, Ambassador?
Yes.
You know, I must be careful not to be overly optimistic and naive, which I tend to be. But, you know, my generation let the country down. There's no two ways about it. You know, we were inward looking, we were myopic, and we know the consequences. But this younger generation, I think partly due to the internet and modern communications, etc., they are far more open-minded than my generation. That is the sense. In fact, I've been talking about this a little bit also, that this inward-looking kind of perspective that was there, dominating the discourse in Sri Lanka, is only beginning, I think, to come apart. And it's being driven by the young people. Yeah.
Very good. One other question to you, Indrajit.
Yeah.
From Mohit Daga. What are the lessons that India needs to learn from this?
You know, India had $1 trillion of foreign investment last year. So I don't know how much we have to teach India. And it has reserves now, I think, if I'm not mistaken, of well over $400 billion. 600 billion.
Yes.
Sorry, that's right, 600 billion. So, you know, the important thing here was, I think, you cannot deviate from the economic perspective. You cannot deviate from basic economic principles. You know, it's fine to have a homegrown strategy, but you know, you can't have tax cuts which take your revenue down to 8% of GDP when your expenditure is 19-20% of GDP. You know, that's just not possible. And then that leads to this massive printing of money. So those kind of things, you know, and then to say that it doesn't lead to inflation, you know, I mean, these are fundamental economic facts that you can't deny. And so, you know, you have to stick to those fundamental facts. And the other thing is also, you know, one needs to have a lot of humility. You need a large dose of humility when one is taking decisions on the economic front, because there are so many uncontrollable variables which affect an economy. So you have to basically be data-driven, be evidence-driven, and be objective. And as policymakers, look for the best choice in the given circumstances without having any prior biases or prejudices in your decision making.
There's a whole bunch of questions asking about China's role, which I maybe the simplest is to say, how would you describe China's role during the crisis? Is the crisis leading to a rethinking by the Chinese towards Sri Lanka? There are other questions asking about Sri Lanka towards China. Would anyone like to comment on that?
I mean, shall I kind of, on the Chinese debt trap, I think that there is quite a lot of misinformation on that. China's debt accounts for 10% of our external debt stock. Pretty much the same as Japan, and less than the ADB and the World Bank. Now, you can talk about the quality of the investment that finance. That's a different issue altogether. But in terms of it being an overwhelming burden, no, it is not. But what is now, what was interesting is the Chinese were pretty hard-nosed. When it came to supporting us as the credibility of the economic policies deteriorated and the economic hole was getting bigger, they didn't throw money at it. They in fact, I think the Sri Lankan authorities were disappointed by the Chinese reaction, because the Chinese are extremely hard-nosed. They're not going to throw good money after bad. And so while they did provide some support, I suspect not as much as Sri Lanka hoped for. But China has a crucial role to play now as we move towards debt restructuring. Historically, China has not wanted to restructure its debt. It is happy to refinance the debt. For instance, they have offered us $1 billion loan to repay the $900 million of debt servicing that we owe to them. But that is not sufficient, because for us to achieve debt sustainability, we need to restructure. We need to have a haircut that has to be given to the creditors. So the other creditors are all watching to see how we treat China. If China is allowed to only refinance its debt, then the others are also not going to agree to restructure and take a haircut. And we will not achieve our objective of moving to debt sustainability. So now it's very important that China gives us the support to achieve the objectives that we need to achieve on the debt sustainability front. Not just, I won't get into technicalities, but in net present value terms, the treatment of all creditors has to be the same. And the Chinese, I hope, will help us to achieve that.
That's a very good point, actually, that all creditors have to be treated the same. But Chinese have been quite hard-nosed about Pakistan's financial issues as well, actually.
They've been hard-nosed all around, I must say, yeah.
Yes, Professor Muni.
They are hard-nosed, all right, but, when we talk of this factor, why did they not calculate that the projects they are investing in would not yield revenues which are required? Number one. Number two, as everybody knows, that BRI is being revised every day, and there are all kind of questions which have come up on BRI. I want to I want to react to these questions of foreign assistance and the resolution of the crisis. In fact, I am totally with Dr. Coomaraswamy when he says internal economy will have to be generated, because every foreign assistance, I'm sure, I know zero economics, but both China and India are in a position to write off all the loans overnight. There's absolutely no problem in terms of financial capacity, but it will have cost for Sri Lanka, because those who are going to do this will demand their own pound of flesh, whether Sri Lanka is interested or prepared for that or not, and I would say should not be prepared for it. Therefore, it is necessary for Sri Lanka to generate its own economic parameters in a manner that they can meet the crisis, rather than looking at outside agencies, either India or China or IMF, or the Asian Infrastructure Bank or anybody else, because it will involve some costs in one way or the other.
Thank you for that dose of realism. There are a couple of questions actually from Santosh Menon, Giridhar Radhakrishnan. Can Mr. Coomaraswamy and Bhavana suggest names of people who they would like to see in government to bring about system change? There's also a question, can the advisory team of industry captains announced earlier, can they be a temporary government? I suppose the question is really, can we go outside the political system? Can we envisage a team? I mean, for me, Sri Lanka has always been this wonderful example of so much more talent than you would expect out of the numbers. And excellence in a whole host of fields, from economics to architecture to you name it, cricket, wherever. And so, yes, it should be possible. I think we've been arguing that it's politically feasible and there is a route to it, but that it all depends on the president resigning, isn't it? But let me pose it to you. I shouldn't be trying to answer this.
Can I come in here?
Yeah, do.
I think what's interesting with this moment is we are also trying to think outside of the conventional, no? And I think that's a good opportunity to start kind of thinking about at least what are the new things we need to bring into parliament. I mean, the problem with the present parliament and parliamentarians are they're very much entitled. They think, just because someone in their family was in politics that they have a right to be there. I think this is the time to really think about experts, those who are, trained in particular areas that is required in terms of policy making, in terms of strengthening committees. I think particular skills can be brought in. So we need to really think about who is able to come in, not just the popular dimension, but those who can bring in substance. And that's going to be the tricky one, because I think there are many who are trying to get into the next parliament, pitching at social media, but really may not bring in the substance that's required or the ideas. So it's really that there's a couple of entities that are playing quite an active role, and I think it's worth looking at them. The Bar Association has been very active in terms of engaging with the different stakeholders and providing some proposals and some good proposals, but they come from a very legal, rule of law based position. The Chamber of Commerce is also engaging. I think it's worth looking at some individuals who can bring in, because of the economic dimension and revenue generation. And let's not forget the younger people. I think we need younger people in parliament to really, we have a lot of members of parliament in Sri Lanka. I mean, I'm sure some won't be happy with it, but we need youth, we need women. So I think that this gives us an opportunity to think about individuals and ideas that can come in. But I also want to say it's not just parliament. There is a provincial council system that we need to think about, local government. So really taking power closer to the people and really encouraging more people, more younger people, more diversity in these institutions. I think that's lacking. So I'm not naming names, but there are some ideas.
But I'm so glad you mentioned young people, because there's a question from Tisura Gamage, actually. What is your advice about successfully and practically channeling the energy of young protesters into governance reforms and economic reforms? Which is really, it is an important question. How do you get all that energy you've generated on the street into actually policy making and decision making? And how do you not leave them disappointed at the end of this process, feeling that they wasted their time? You don't want a lost generation at the end of this.
I think if I may just address the previous question and maybe this as well in a way, I think, I think more than personalities, I think it's important that we strengthen our institutions and processes. I talked about the independence of the central bank, the Auditor General's function, the parliamentary committees. all these need to be strengthened, and support should be given for them to build their capacity. Because if we have a strong institution and checks and balances, then of course personalities matter. I don't want to underplay that, but the system will have a framework within which it will operate, and that framework needs to be strengthened. So whoever comes in has to operate within a framework. And I'd like to mention one other thing, and that is, financing of political parties and politicians. It is incredibly expensive to do politics in Sri Lanka for individual politicians. Our electoral system is such that they have to spend a lot of money, because not only do they compete against the opposition candidates, but they also have there's a preference vote, so they have to compete even against their colleagues in their own party. So there's a lot of money, and so people come with big IOUs and often to pretty unsavory characters in our society who are able to make money in illicit ways. So that whole nexus also needs to be taken apart. I personally feel there should be a limit on the financing of political candidates. Now, people tell me that it's very difficult to monitor, but I know in some countries like the UK, there is a limit. And if you punish somebody who violates it, I think it'll have a deterrent effect. So this whole thing, strong institutions, strengthen processes, make sure that the political financing issue is looked at, so that the present nexus of criminal elements and unsavory people is broken.
Well, thank you. I think we're really running out of time now, and I have to. I'm not even going to try and summarize such a rich discussion, because I think it really has been a wonderful discussion among the panelists. And I really must thank all three of you for what you've said and what you brought to this discussion. For me, it was a real pleasure to see a lot of old friends in the chat box and in the Q&A box, and to see so many friends from Sri Lanka and others who are interested in what happens in Sri Lanka. I can only hope that Sri Lanka comes out of this as quickly and as well as is possible. Really, I don't think we can say much more than thank you and all the very best to you, to our friends in Sri Lanka.
Thanks to the chair.
So
thank you very much. Yes, Ambassador. Thank you very much.
Thank you.